Could we have this lobbying report marked as the next exhibit, please?
We haven't marked tab 49 yet, so that'll be marked as 1835.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask to go to your conversation, Mr. prompted me to go to document number 34 in Conservation's list. It's a document titled Kaya/DFO California Trip Report. And it appears as though this references a meeting with Safeway and so forth. Is this what you had in mind when you were discussing your evidence?
Yes, it's interesting. This is from Mr. Swartfager's files, and it's interesting that he puts Kaya first and DFO second. But yes, this was the follow-up, the memo summarizing the trip that he and Ms. Salmon took to California. I think what I also find unfortunate here is that the grocery retail sector is shifting. Increasingly, they are adopting sustainable seafood policies. Safeway, Loblaw, the major chains, Overweighty Food Group, they are all adopting and setting timelines for implementation of sustainability policies around the seafood that they will sell. And in all responsible seafood sustainability programs such as the Monterey Bay or Sea Choice, where assessments are conducted of fisheries and they are categorized as to whether they should be red listed, which is avoid, or yellow or green. Open neck cage farm salmon falls into the red listed category. The only one that is green listed and given a sustainability ranking by Monterey Bay, for example, is the Aquaseed closed containment recirculating facility in Washington State. So what we're seeing is a market trend to phase out red-listed species and stop carrying them in the grocery stores, at the same time that the Canadian government and the industry here in British Columbia are digging in their heels, denying the evidence, and resisting any change. The investment is going on in the United States, and while we're bickering, they're going to be cornering the market on more sustainable production methods. I just think that that's very short-sighted of the Canadian government, and that they should shift their priorities, stop defending practices that are indefensible, and invest in innovation and change.
Could we have this Kaya DFO California Trip Report marked as the next exhibit, please?
1836.
Before leaving funding, I want to turn to another acronym, and I think the next set of questions may be for you, Mr. Backman. If I can have Exhibit 1734, please, on the screen. This is an email chain that appears to be emanating from Mary Ellen. That would be Mary Ellen Walling, to your best of your knowledge, Mr. Backman?
Yes.
And if you can just scroll down to the second email chain, you'll see that there's a reference there in an email from Mary Ellen dated August 18, and you're copied in that email chain. Do you see that, Mr. Backman?
Yes, I do.
And the topic is the this ACRDP committee and its source of funding, and whether or not that source of funding is going to be afforded to Dr. Christy Miller with respect to being enabling her to test some of the Atlantic salmon in open net cages for her, what she describes as her parvovirus. So that's the context as I understand it. Do I have that right?
That's correct. There, Ms. Walling is mentioning that that the two things really, that now that there's the beginnings of the understanding of a parvovirus that can be actually tested for, that she's coordinating the response by the industry to provide samples. But based on the fact that there's limited funding in order to do this work, Ms. Walling is also finding some access to some existing ACRDP money that could be made available so that those samples can be processed and can further Christy Miller's work.
So what does that acronym stand for, the ACRDP? I stumped you on that one.
You did stump me this morning on that one.
Yeah.
It's a federal government program of research which is set up to partner with aquaculture, all kinds of aquaculture, whereby federal research can be brought forward, initiatives that are of interest both to the industry and federal government researchers. And it requires a component of funding from both parties, in cash or in kind from industry.
All right. And as I understand it, Ms. Walling sits on this ACRDP committee, does she not?
Right.
Just because I like to have a very clean record if we can do it, the PPR at page 150 gives a list of acronyms. Aquaculture Collaborative Research and Development Program is our note of that acronym.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. So if I can just scroll down to the initial email that has given rise to this chain in which you were copied. It's a lengthy email from Dr. Miller Saunders, and if you can go to the next page, about the middle of the page, I had heard, you see there's a third paragraph there, I had heard that there was some ACRDP money that has not yet been spent, about $30,000, I believe. And she goes on to say, as we do not have funding to do this screening, it would be helpful, she's writing to Mary Ellen Walling, if you could suggest to Laura Brown, who as I understand is a DFO representative, that this work could be funded using these extra funds. Otherwise, the actual screening will have to await our funding, our finding funds to do so. So it looks as though this ACRDP, which is a collaborative effort between industry and DFO science, has some money, and that's why Dr. Miller is trying to tap into that. Is that your understanding of what was going on at this time?
Yeah, that's my understanding, yes.
Now, getting back to the issue of, could I have conservation document number 48, please? Do you recognize this, Ms. Stewart?
Yes.
It's a letter dated May 27, 2001, and you're writing to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, Minister Ashfield.
That's correct.
Could we have that marked as the next exhibit, please?
1837.
Under the heading synthetic parasiticides, under the first, you reference some issues. Or do you want to just speak generally to this letter first, and then we can look
Sure.
at some of the topics?
The Canadian government is currently has a program underway to secure organic certification for open net cage farm salmon products in Canada. And we've been extremely concerned about this. We heard from parties within DFO that discussions had been initiated with the aquaculture industry. Those were taking place behind closed doors. There was no effort to seek input from other parties. DFO and industry representatives were developing the draft standard on their own. We were told that we would have an opportunity to engage in the dialogue once there was a draft standard and it went to the Canadian General Standards Board, who would then take over the process of working through towards a certification standard, an organic certification standard. When the draft standard first came out, it was going to allow antibiotic use, for example, on the farms, which is fundamentally contrary to the very notion of organically certified food products. We had been working with various terrestrial organic associations and farm associations, and they were extremely concerned that if this was allowed to go forward without stronger criteria, it would undermine the value of the organic label as a whole in Canada, because consumers would become uncertain whether pesticides were allowed in organically certified foods, whether antibiotics were allowed in organically certified foods. It was looking to us as though the department was more or less going to certify the status quo. One of the requirements of organic certification for terrestrial animals is that the feed itself has to be organic, but the determination of the industry and the department was that you can't certify wild forage fish, such as Peruvian anchoveta, which are ground up and turned into fish meal and oil to feed the pellets to the farm salmon. You can't certify those as organic because they're a wild species, so therefore there wouldn't be a requirement for organic feed going into the product either. So this is still ongoing. We have engaged as representatives of CAR in the National Organic Standard Board process in the United States. We've intervened in that. And the U.S. has a draft standard currently up for consideration by the FDA, which is quite a bit stricter than the current draft standard that is under discussion in Canada. There's a concern there, though, because there is sort of a harmonization agreement between Canada and the United States that would potentially bring the standards down to the lowest common denominator. So if Canada goes forward with an extremely weak standard, that could also impact a slightly more credible standard in the United States and tend to put downward pressure on that. And we believe it's just wholly inappropriate for, again, our Department of Fisheries and Oceans, our government, to be seeking market access for open neck cage salmon by investing in a program to certify that product as organic to an extremely low standard.
Can we have this letter marked as the next exhibit, please?
1838.
And
Our note is it may already be 1837, so we can cancel the last assignment of number things.
That's correct, it's 1837.
sorry. I want to quickly turn now to conservation document number 43, Ms. Stewart. Which should be one of your productions, a
Yes.
resource guide to farm salmon certifications.
Correct.
This is set out basically the background on eco-certifications and certifications dealing with farm salmon worldwide.
It does. What we did was there's a growing number of certification schemes. Some of them are industry-driven. Some of them are, multi-stakeholder processes. But increasingly, there's a desire on the part of the industry to have some sort of sustainability label on their product. So we looked at the standards that were determined by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and by ISEAL, the International Social and Environmental Standards Accreditation. I'm sorry, I can't remember the details of the acronym, but it's in the report. But both of those bodies define what are the elements that constitute a credible certification program. That doesn't necessarily mean that the standard itself will be a good standard, but if you're going to develop a program in order to issue a certification standard, what are the elements of that program? And those include that it's scientifically based, that it's transparent, that it is multi-stakeholder, that the standards are publicly available and can be assessed. What goes into that label? What is it that allows that that certification label to claim that it is more environmentally sustainable than another? And this looks at various programs such as the Global Aquaculture Alliance and the Cook Aquaculture's True North label, and assesses them against those UN Food and Agriculture Organization criteria.
Could we have that marked, please? Mr. Commissioner, I'm in your hands. I've got about 5 minutes left to me in my allotment. We could either take the break now or I can push on and finish. That's all I have. Thank you.
We're talking about 1838.
I think the important thing about this report, and it was written as a guide for retailers, is that it informs them on whether or not the various labels that are being pushed by the industry meet those criteria that would deem them to be at least credible. And then beyond that, you can look at the details of the standard itself and say, do the indicators for that standard seem appropriate? Are they really achieving a degree of increased environmental sustainability?
I'm going to
If
just note for the record that Mr. Backman wants to reply, but I'm in my last 5 minutes, and I want to end with the topic. And I'm going to suggest that my learned colleague, Mr. Blair, can perhaps ask that in redirect. So you can put your marker in, Mr. Backman, and hopefully Mr. Blair will pick you up on that. I want to end by looking at some of the discussion that I heard yesterday with respect to the precautionary principle that I thought was quite interesting that you engaged in, Ms. Parker. And before I do so, I don't know whether you actually acknowledged, Mr. Backman, that your company buys into the precautionary approach and precautionary principle as well. Is that not right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And specifically, you raised it with regard to citing. You said, for example, this is evidence, this is what you, at least I think what I heard you say, Ms. Parker, this is evidence that the companies take into consideration the precautionary principle because we don't cite fish farms within 1 kilometer of known salmon-bearing streams. Do I have your evidence more or less encapsulated correctly?
I think I said that the federal government has a precautionary approach framework for the
Yes.
regulation, and we follow the regulation.
Right. So, but basically, as good corporate citizens, you would want to be precautious too in terms of whatever environmental degradation you might be causing. Isn't that fair, Mr. Backman?
I think the precautionary principle of going forward is a foundational element of how business and our business conducts itself. So the answer is yes. Precautionary principle, though, uses the best available information and is adaptive as we learn more.
But it also references the fact that if you have a uncertain area, in other words, if the science is uncertain, that you take measures in order to protect the environment. Isn't that a fair restatement of the precautionary principle?
Yes, and I think we mentioned a few. The 1 kilometer separation applied to all streams and all rearing area is an example. Separation from shellfish beaches is an example. Well, additional work is done to fill in the scientific knowledge.
And there's also a separation between farms, as well as I understand it. Is there not?
They're currently at 3 kilometers
Right,
separation in Boucher.
So the farms are situated 3 kilometers from one another. And so if science were to say, for example, that 1 kilometer is not sufficient, that we have evidence that there's actually spread of pathogens or sea lice on a greater distance, say 5 to 8 kilometers, obviously then if DFO as the regulator were to come back to you and say, well, we think you should be citing your farms 8 kilometers, for example, from fish farms and also 8 kilometers from streams that have salmon in them, you would, of course, comply with that, would you not?
That's a really good statement, and I think we can go back to the fact that the separation from streams has already gone through a stage of change under the very early set of guidelines. It was 1 nautical mile. Between salmon farms, it was 1 nautical mile separation. When the provincial government license came in, it was extended to 3 kilometers separation based on a whole bunch of information that had been made available at that time. It stayed at 3 kilometers now for over 20, 30 years, 20 years I should say, and it's stood the test of time in terms of additional information coming forward. Should that be resolved again, either less or greater than 3 kilometers, and we'd adjust our business to operate accordingly.
But isn't it time that we revisit those siting criteria? I mean, it's been in place for 20 years. Isn't it time that we actually take a look at the state of the science today and actually revisit that siting criteria with an aim to determining what would be the precautionary approach, what would be precautionary in light of what we now know about the migratory pathway of Fraser River sockeye and what we now know about the spread of pathogens. Isn't it time that we actually revisited that issue?
I think it's being revisited continuously as the environmental assessments are done on salmon farms, and as new information is gathered, the valued ecosystem component tables are updated, and it's an ongoing process of looking at it.
And
But what
Mr.
we're failing to see is any real change in the industry. So all of the revisiting in the world is not going to matter to the wild salmon or to the health of our marine ecosystems if it doesn't result in actual change. And I think it's important to remember that the definition of the precautionary approach that Mr. Blair put up on the screen yesterday said, where there are threats of irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty is not a reason to fail to act. And the weight of evidence continues to mount, and our government continues to fail to act. So I can only encourage the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to take their responsibility to Canadians seriously and start acting.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my submissions.